Good morning, folks. This is Paul Harvey, and now the rest of the story. No, my name's Harrison Whitney, but this is the rest of the story I left off on March 27th, 2020. Some more pieces of the puzzle, and they're going to be disparate, disjointed, but you can put them together. It's like a jigsaw puzzle. For example, I spoke of the 10,000-year history of China. They've seen this coronavirus at least, maybe 50, maybe 100 times. So they have much familiarity with it. They have the monsoons, the early monsoons that actually probably had something to do with blowing the virus into Italy, which is very proximate. It doesn't have to cross a large body of water. You can take a train to Italy. You can drive to Italy from China. But the avoidance is great bodies of water for this particular virus. And practically all viruses attempt to avoid water because of the phytoplankton, which accounts for about 80% of the photosynthetic apparatus, or the photosynthetic process. And also, it's what's called phytoplankton that are actually green pigments on the surface of great bodies of water. Now, how it got into Michigan, it just came through Ohio and got into the state of Michigan. Didn't have to cross a great body of water, but yeah, that's just one element. Last evening, on 27th, I spoke of the two strands of DNA molecule and the one strand RNA molecule, which is a messenger for DNA. Two strands of DNA, one strand RNA. A king once said, "A threefold cord is not easily broken." The mutation actually is carried out by what's called RNA, or ribonucleic acid. It makes a switch from the acidic base of thymine, and it becomes uracil on the RNA strain. That's a bit of a technicality that's easily explained and simplified. That causes what's called mutation. Survival of the fittest and natural selection are just biological facts. It is not inconsistent with Christianity or Christian doctrine. Let's make that clear. There's no inconsistency there. Whenever one makes a scientific claim or develops a scientific hypothesis, if it's not supported by mathematics, then it becomes pseudoscience or false science. It's not science. String theory is a classic example of what advanced physics is now working. And the problem is string theory is nearly fully acceptable that there are at least 10, 11 dimensions. We're four-dimensional creatures with breadth, length, and the fourth dimension is time. We know the universe is a composite of at least 9, perhaps 11 dimensions, like a violin, string theory. Play a violin, there's always a missing note. As complex and as consistent as a violin, and that's probably why Einstein was that was his favorite and his only instrument. He played it for played it for a living, as a matter of fact, part-time. But anyway, another aspect of the story, or my presentation, is that all of my appeal has been to authority. James Watson, who shared the Nobel Prize for Physics, along with Sir Francis Crick. But before 1962 being awarded the Nobel Prize, both men who shared the Nobel Prize, I go back to my first appeal to authority, Dr. Otto Warburg, in 1930, Nobel laureate, upon which my book, primarily Persistence of Memory, heavily relies upon. He has what's called an oxygen connection between cancer and oxygen. Now, many cancers, if not most, the causal nexus, they're caused by viruses. The human papillomavirus is what I focus on mainly in Persistence of Memory, a book that was published in the Library of Congress now. It got there in 1977. And it belabors the coronavirus and the mechanics of what's involved. It's a scientific novel, published in 1977. It has a card catalog number in the Library of Congress. It has an international standard book number. It's on Amazon.com. But rather than promote the book, I'd rather speak in terms of parts of the puzzle. Number one, J. Donald Trump, our president, is a very, I will say, he's a very disliked man in many camps. But the one thing about this man is he's a jabber. He pokes. He pierces. He uses a language extremely fundamental and extremely well. And the reason I say that is because one of my main areas of study in graduate work in philosophy is I had to study a lot of linguists, philosophers of language. Peter Strawson, the great mathematical logician, Willard Van Orman Quine, emeritus professor at Harvard University, Noam Chomsky, and perhaps the greatest of them all, perhaps the greatest genius of the 20th century in philosophy of language was Ludwig Wittgenstein. So in language, for example, Wittgenstein argued that language should always paint a picture. It should be simplified and picture language. And his one great example was a cat on the mat. We can picture that. Well, many things that Donald Trump utilizes is picture language. And he's very effective with not making coming up with leading questions, but he makes leading statements. One example, the last statement I heard him make, supposedly written, I don't know if it's true or as he would say, it's fake language. But he says, I've done greater things than Jesus of Nazareth, the Christ of God. Well, many people are going to really take offense with that. All he has to say is, well, the reason I said that is because that's what Jesus said. Men will do far greater things than I've done. Greater in number. Not greater in importance or magnitude or quality, but greater things. That irks people. Another thing is his background is Scripture, is Christianity, because he utilizes it so effectively. For example, here's another example. Let's get back to business on April 12th. But now let's parse out that language. Let's parse out that date. So I checked the date and I said, well, April 12th is on a Sunday. When the captains of industry rest on a Sunday, for the most part. The captains of industry would start on the 13th of April, if they were to start. But it just so happens that April 12th is what we refer to in the vernacular as Easter Sunday. I'll give you a short story. I used to visit quite a bit Hazel Park racetrack at Hazel Park, Michigan. And I would go on Friday, Good Friday, sometimes on Saturday, but there was always a gigantic poster, neon lights, and it says, closed on the day of the resurrection. Now, the day of the resurrection is commonly referred to where you can reach more people by saying Easter Sunday. But we know that industry doesn't start on Easter Sunday. It starts a day after. But J. Donald Trump says, let's get started on April 12th. Well, I checked the date for April 12th. That's the day of the resurrection. What does he want? What does he want to resurrect? You see, and you have to spell resurrection correctly. There are two R's in resurrection. But that's beside the point. The point made here is, though I made reference to some minor technicalities or biological or biochemical analysis of DNA and RNA, and you're quite familiar with that terminology. But what I wish to say, or the point, or the segue, I use that as a segue into something that's pertinent about how China gets on its feet so quickly. And everyone else is behind times. China is ready to roll. Why is that the case? Well, as I mentioned on 327, they have a 10,000-year history. They've seen this virus many, many times before, not COVID-19 necessarily, but many versions of it, 50, maybe 100, maybe 210,000 years. So they knew they had to clean those streets. They had to drag you in. if they had to take you by force, you got to clean all of China. And that's essentially what occurred. And the laboratory examination primarily focused on ribonucleic acid, RNA, which is a messenger for DNA. And what RNA does is replicates or transfers information that's provided by DNA. So that's where your mutations will occur. So COVID-19 is mutated countless numbers of times. It's near two great bodies of water. It's on the edges. New York is on the Atlantic. But how many cases are on Long Island? Take that into account. Long Island is not listed as one of the 5 boroughs of New York. Long Island is nearly a separate, it's an island. But this virus has to cross a body of water to get to Long Island. So think about the number of cases that's in Long Island as compared to central New York, Manhattan, the borough, Bronx, Brooklyn, Staten Island, Queens. And the virus is not about to go into the Atlantic. California is bound by the Pacific. Well, both great bodies of water will actually eventually meet. One is salt water, the other is fresh water. Atlantic is fresh water, Pacific is salt water. And they meet, but they don't they don't mix. There's a wall between the Atlantic and the Pacific. Now, be this as it may, how do you force the virus into the Pacific to meet the phytoplankton, which is the origins, practically 80% of photosynthetic apparatus, or the photosynthetic process occurs. What China does, going back, here's another piece, they're the most toxic, had the most toxic atmosphere known to man because of coal burning. So what they had to do was shut down all the coal burning. And as a result, it reopened the photosynthetic apparatus. The sun was shining, it was striking the green pigments on plants. Oxygen was released. All the people were off the street. I can go on and on, just giving elements. I'm not a clinician, I'm not a medical doctor, I'm not an epidemiologist. However, prior to 1977, I started in 1963, looking through microscopes, having access to the electron microscope. But I knew that this wasn't the answer. The approach I took was, as I mentioned earlier, the co-recipient of the Nobel Prize in 1962, Dr. James Watson, along with Sir Francis Crick. What Dr. Watson did was actually, rather than peer through microscopes, he assembled a jigsaw puzzle and wanted to know exactly how connections were made between these nucleic acids. Now remember, the Earth's atmosphere is 78% nitrogen. This COVID-19, this virus, is 100% nitrogenous base, means it's nitrogen. So it's airborne. It used as its vehicle of travel the nitrogen molecule. So one has to devise a method to blow it out to the Pacific, blow it out to the Atlantic. But China had help from nature. It shut down its coal production completely. It had an early monsoon that blew it into Italy. So I want to leave it at that. Now, on pages 23 to 27 in Persistence of Memory, my scientific novel, you get a clear, concise, scientific look at exactly how a uracil on the strain of RNA interacts, creates a mutation, and eventually evolves by natural selection and survival of the fittest into this monster molecule that we now know as COVID-19. Any further inquiries on this particular dialogue, one may contact my attorney, my assistant and counselor who's over the project, by emailing Spicer Christine, all one word, SPICERCHRISTINE, numeral 4242 at yahoo.com. Thanks for listening, and we'll get through this hopefully by the day of the resurrection that we commonly call Easter. And then we go back to work on Easter Sunday, or as I like to say, and I always say, on the day of the resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth, the Christ of God. Thank you. Oh, I'm Harrison Whitney. I'm not Paul Harvey. But hopefully I give you part of the rest of the story. Good day, and God bless.